Is Abdullah. I am a past debater for AIS and a past National Development Squad coach, and I'll be discussing the SBC final motion today, which is this house prefers a world where there is a predominant belief that the currency of life is time. In just before getting to case, in terms of just basic like debate strategy here, it's a narrative motion, which means that a good debate would expect to have a good back and forth and a good like contention on what the manifestations of this narrative or this predominant belief looks like and how it is interpreted by society. So in terms of fiat here, I think at the very top, it's pretty simple that props fiat here is that it will be in that this predominant belief / narrative would exist in society, but not but they do not have the fiat to say that it would automatically be existing in a good way, which means that they need to prove it, and which means that there's also going to be substantial opposition contention onto how it's been interpreted, how it will be implemented in society. So how this debrief will be going is I'll first be discussing prop case, then I'm going to op case, then I'll be moving on to like general like debate strategy for prop and op both, and then we move on to what the clashes would be and how each side would attempt to weigh each clash. In terms of the prop case, and I'm going to first move on to setup, and I think a few things are needed to like frame this debate or set this debate up very well. First thing that I think prop has to do very well is to explain to the house at which point of life is this predominant belief going to take place, in an attempt to preempt any opposition pushback saying that even poor people who absolutely need money would be coerced into this narrative. So ideally, a good proposition strategy here in setup would be they would say that they would explain and illustrate that till a certain point in a person's life, there is a proportional relationship between money and the utility that they gain. That is, say, at the point at which they can't put any money on food on the table, even if they have all the time in the world, they are not going to have any form of utility and happiness because they're hungry. So then, a proposition needs to frame this debate taking place at the point at which someone has achieved a stable life, where the relationship and the relationship between like money and the utility that you have is weaker than it would be previously. This means that after a stable position in life, whether this debate takes place or whether you want to work like extra few hours to get that extra dollar or go home and spend it with your family. The second area of setup that I am framing that prop needs to do pretty well is to preempt any opposition pushback that people are just going to stop caring about money altogether. Similar to the first one, but this is slightly different. They say that people still care about earning money and will still do things to earn money in the first place. The delta then again is how you spend that extra time. And what proposition needs to do here is that they need to firstly prove that this is likely to happen, that people are still going to care about earning money, and then prove what their comparative actually looks like. So what proposition ideally should be doing, and like in a few ways, and such as like saying people still want to achieve luxuries, they still want to have, which means that they still have an incentive to earn money, although this isn't their main incentive. The second thing they can also talk about is that that individuals can have different multiple priorities on their comparative, multiple priorities, and this will link to a later point of setup that I'll be talking about. But the difference is that they won't always choose have earning money over extra time that they can spend with family. Oftentimes they're prioritizing the time that they have over earning their money, but they still want to earn that money, and that nuance is very important. Very important. And the general like idea then is that okay, you need money. People need money overall to achieve and live a decent enough life. That means the money is a prerequisite for the time, and the time is what matters. And you frame is that status quo is where the time is, and the time that you invest into earning money is the prerequisite for a good life, and therefore money is the currency of life in the first place. So therefore you flip this and say no, instead the prerequisite for time is money, and therefore you need money to well spend your time well and like live a good life or whatnot. The third piece of setup then is about is to prove why capitalistic structures would still exist, and let's say that people are still there's going to be still a human nature of competition, that people are still going to be wanting to one up each other, that corporations are still going to do things to achieve like societal progress, and that's where capitalistic structures that allow society to move forward and the engine of society will continue to exist. And the last piece of setup, and I think this is very important, is to push a burden onto opposition, saying that on their comparative, that the currency of life then would become money, and your value is automatically tied to your money. That means your net worth is basically defines how your life is. And there's two things you need to do to achieve this burden push successfully. Firstly, you need to tell us why this is likely to be the dominant narrative in the absence of the belief on which prop is pushing, that the time is currency, where the predominant belief in the absence of this would be that the money is the currency of life. life. And I think the simplest way to do this is to prove that systematically it is. That is, say that oftentimes in society, in status quo, people trade in their labor and the time that they have for money, which means that the time that they are putting into is not what they're aiming for, but it's instead the money that they're earning as a result of that time and a result of systematic systems itself is what they're aiming for. This means that the overall worth of a person's life and everything that they're working towards in a life is about their money, which means that the predominant belief and the predominant norm in society would be that the money is the currency of time. The second thing you need to prove here is that on your word, the narrative that time is the currency of life is likely to flip society. I think it's just simply just talking about how what matters is that how you spend time in society, and also just frame time itself as a non-renewable diminishing resource. That is, say that the second that every second that passes is less valuable than the second before, which means that you have very incentive to spend each second that you have more in a better way, then because eventually the value of your time is going to be significantly lower, which means an 80-year-old is going to have a significantly less value of his time than a 30-year-old, because the 30-year-old has so much more, which means because time is a non-renewable diminishing resource, the narrative itself would shift in society, and therefore people would, and you are able to claim a lot of the benefits that you won't be claiming in terms of the case. Moving on to proposition, in terms of the proposition argumentation, I think there are two things that you can run here, two major things. Firstly, on better fulfillment, this is the intuitive case that you can run, and by proving why people are likely to have better, greater fulfilled lives, and this is the primary path to victory for prop. There's three ways that ideally that I would run this, and there's possibly more, but this is the three ways that I thought was the strongest. Firstly is that you're able to spend more time on your relationships and experiences. This is that because your currency of life is time, you're spending time with the people who make your life fulfilled. You make memories with these people and you experience new things. You do things that more than just working unnecessarily long hours, but you're able to actually enjoy your life and things that achieve fulfillment for you, because you know that time is important and more important than the money you can get from working elsewhere, which means you're liberating people out of a corporate rat race or the capitalistic society, and you're telling them that okay, just spend the life anymore, and that norm and the expectation for them to work long hours no longer exists. The second thing how you prove that there's going to be better fulfillment is that is the pragmatic approach, where you say that people are less likely to save money. That is, say that they know that there is no material benefit of saving money. That when they're 80 years old, if they have $6 million, it does not matter, because it does not matter because nobody really thinks of that as a really great thing. Which means that they no longer save money and they're incentivized to use it currently. Which means more people are going to be doing things like traveling. They are going to be doing things that actually give them fulfillment. Which means that they are able to take money that they would otherwise save on opposition's world and actually do things that give them better fulfillment, or buy a better house, or buy jewelry for your wife or whatnot. The third way is that you are less likely to compare yourself with other people. What this means is that how you prove this is that in a world where the primary value of your life is, and the currency of life is money, it is a quantifiable measure. That is, say that the amount of money you have in your net worth is directly comparable to your neighbors, for example. The delta on your comparative is that you're spending time. If you feel fulfilled by the fact that you're spending good enough time and you're spending your time well, and the time that you're spending is giving you good enough fulfillment, it is very hard to compare that to your neighbor who may also be doing it in a different way, which means that you're less likely to compare with other people. You're less likely to feel bad about your life not being good because you know your fulfillment is great, which means that you stop comparing your life, and therefore because of a less comparison, you'll feel better about yourself, and you don't constantly look down upon everything you achieved in life because of somebody else's achievements. This means that you stop comparing, and therefore you have a better fulfillment. I think these are the three ways that you can probably prove better fulfillment and better fulfillment on prop. In terms of the second argument, I think the second argument then is about helping the most vulnerable people in society, and there's again three ways that I would probably do this. Two ways which are pretty strong, and the third one is something that is a bit more contentious and maybe may not work all the time. The first one is about this myth of upward mobility. You frame society as that everyone is expected and is told that they should work a lot for low pay or whatnot in society, for the promise or the potential to eventually go up. This looks like a corporate ladder where you work as a lower level position for very, very long hours, with the promise that eventually you're able to go upwards and you're able to earn more, and you're able to spend less, work less hours and stuff like that. Which means that people oftentimes accept exploitation in society. They work long hours with very low pay because they are told that there is upward mobility. On your comparative, then on props comparative, you don't succumb to this because you know how valuable your time is. Your time is literally what defines your life. Therefore, you know that you do not want to waste your time for a possibility of upward mobility somewhere down the line, which means that because you no longer care about the extra higher salary that you're going to be making, because if you're earning enough now, you don't buy into this and you're not going to be exploited, which means that probably workers are likely to stand up and ask for better conditions. But even most of people don't always succumb to these like extremely harmful and extremely competitive norms, extremely competitive structures in society, and they don't buy into the myth of upward mobility, which means that they are more likely to stand up for themselves and get better working conditions. The second mechanism here is that even if the people don't stand up itself, society itself will experience a shift. That is, say the norms will shift in society. That is to be focused on people having more time for themselves. That means working hours will be forged, knowing that that time is valuable and spending a lot of time is less likely. And you prove this by saying that because this happens from the beginning of time, and this is a prevalent narrative throughout society and throughout history, it's probably going to be society itself will be forged on this, which means that even when working hours are made, it will probably be in a way that you have enough time and you don't like spend so much time in it in the first place, because society itself has a very high burden put onto time altogether. The third mechanism here, which is like a bit more contentious, I'm not sure if it's the strongest, is about this idea about you redistributing income. That is, say that you're scared of the stigma of growing old with a lot of money, which means that you don't hold on to that money. You do things like give to the poor and you redistribute your income to poor people because you don't want to be growing old with so much money and experience stigma in society. I'll talk a bit more about stigma in like the opposition case, but in general you prove that okay, you want to redistribute income. This means the most vulnerable people are better off. So in terms of this like general case, I think that's what I would run on prop. On prop. In terms of opposition, I think in terms of setup and the general strategy, in a lot of narrative and predominant beliefs, especially in this house prefers the world, oftentimes opposition has to resort to not purely but primarily a negative case where they try to disprove a lot of the benefits and prove that proposition the world is likely to be much more harmful. And there are some like positive pushes on why society itself has improved because of the problem on opposition exclusively. But I do think the general strategy in debates like this is where you oftentimes, especially through good responses and good mitigatory analysis, you try to push a negative case onto prop and say that world is not as good as is pretty bad, and therefore your world is marginally better, even if there's some bad things that exist in your society. In terms of opposition setup, I think there are four things that need to be there. Firstly, I think you need to claim that your world will probably look like status quo and frame what this looks like. And I think the most strategic way to frame it is that you frame world as where people value time already, they value their relationships, but they also know that money is important to achieve better relationships and a better usage of that time. So therefore, the narratives that you're only in your 20s once and etc. would exist in society. But there's also going to be there will be those like narratives already exist within society, but there is a great awareness of the importance of money, which means people are going to make decisions that they're going to invest to earn a lot of money in the future because they know that's important. And I think that's just how you frame status quo. There's like a lot more that needs to be done, but in general that's what's done. The second thing I think you need to do is, and this is very important, is you to explain how narratives and predominant beliefs are spread in society. Oftentimes what you need to just basically say here is that even though if it's predominant belief, it is probably a belief that is perpetuated by the elite and the richest people in society. That is to say that it is very easy for rich people to say that time is like your currency of life because they have enough money to live a good enough life, which means that oftentimes the rich will be perpetuating this idea that okay, the currency of your life is time, and therefore this will be a coercive effect onto everyone else in society. So even if people who aren't rich, even if you buy into propositions framing, these people will constantly feel a pressure from society to make better use of their time. So even if they're dirt poor, they're going to be looked down upon for working extra hours because that's not how society is built. So I think society is built, and I think this is very important because it builds up a lot of the responses that can come later later, which I'll discuss in a second. The third piece of setup here is about capitalism. I think you talk about why capitalism itself is driven by the thirst for money, and this is like a direct response to the proposition framing about why capitalism is likely to exist. You talk about why pharmaceutical companies only put money into new research because they know that the payout that they can get is very large. So they know that it's okay spending that time. But if on your comparative, like pharmaceutical managers and researchers just don't give a shit about, don't care about it anyway. The fourth thing then is about stigma. There's going to be you proved and you tell why there's going to be a stigma created against people who constantly hold their money, and this is going to look very bad, and some people are just going to be not want to hold their money at all. That means in their young age they're going to be wanting to use majority of the money because the stigma that is created around you holding money when you're older is very great. Let's say if you're 8 years old and you have $60 million in your bank account, people will look at you as society as someone who's just been chasing for money and not lived a good enough life, and this stigma itself is a good enough factor for people to probably give away their money altogether. Or like use up their money in younger ages. In terms of case, again there are two arguments that I would run here. Firstly about why people make bad and short-term decisions and this harms them, and the second one about why society itself like breaks down and the progress reduces. In terms of the first argument, there's three ways you can prove that people make bad decisions. Firstly, you tell that you prove that people no longer put enough time into investment. Let's say oftentimes to earn a lot of money in the future, individuals need heavy investment from the beginning, from like time investment from many years before. That is, say, to become a very good neurosurgeon and earn a lot of money, you still need to put a lot of time to go into med school. You need to spend 6 to 8 years to go into med school, and this is a heavy investment, and you need to grind, and it's oftentimes the things that you don't enjoy. These are things that won't be seen as like a very good fulfillment of your time because you could be doing better things in your 20s. So therefore, individuals are less likely to go into things like med school. They're probably going to be happy with a mediocre job where there's no like room for like very good improvements or like progress in the job itself, which means that a lot of harms will likely to exist, because the investment of going to med school, for example, is that your kids are likely to be able to go to a better university, probably go to med school where they don't have to worry about medical bills. All of these things means that you are able to put an investment into the future for your family, into yourself. Because you don't put this time anymore, because you don't see the value of putting the time, because you make a short-termist decision, you don't do these things, and therefore you lose this investment time and you lose a better life in the long run. The second way you prove that people make bad decisions is that financial fragility. Is that you run this idea about stigma, and that because people don't want to hold money, they encourage just using it up. So in general, you just prove that okay, people are less likely to save money because they make cost-benefit analysis in their head, and because the chance of an emergency is so much lower than the guaranteed fund that you would probably have from spending that extra money and going to like Prague, you choose not to save the money. So and you choose not to save the money in the worry that you will never use that money, and then you will be a victim of the stigma that is created as a result of this. This means that in terms of like emergency and whatnot, this person is probably going to have a very bad life, and there's like in medical emergency they're probably going to be screwed over. The third mechanism here is very similar. Is that again you have financial insecurity, and that you use up all your money and you're old, and when you're old you don't have enough money to enjoy your retirement because you cannot work anymore. There is no money left for you in the end. The last thing here you can prove here is that because of things like FOMO, people will like get paralyzed with things like FOMO, that is say that they know that their time is valuable and they don't want to be wasting their time. They become like paralyzed and constantly are being forced into doing things to make complete value of their time, which means that there is going to be a new rat race created that is constantly being able to use your life to your time to the best of your ability, and this is harmful. So you prove why people make bad decisions and probably live worse lives because of this predominant belief. The second argument, which I think is the most positive push on opposition, is about societal progress breaks down. You prove that society operates on a capitalistic structure where everything happens and progress only happens because of the thirst for extra money, and if you take that need away, the progress significantly would slow down, and this would be harmful. Pharmaceuticals won't be developed and trade won't be happening. All of this happen because people just want more money. So society is no longer willing to take those investments because the time that is probably going to be taken to achieve those like long-term benefits will no longer happen, which means society progress itself will reduce. There's a lot more analysis that needs to be done here, but I think that's a general gist of the argument. In terms of general debate strategy, in terms of like responses and what happens throughout the debate, On proposition, I think there's three things that you need to prove. I think the first one is pretty simple. You need to do a lot of work to prove why current status quo is bad, and therefore you also need to have like some sort of negative case to prove, okay, current status quo is bad. So even if our world is not perfect, it is marginally better than status quo. Secondly, you need to prove that people are going to continue being rational. That means they're not going to be financially insecure, and you need to prove why they're still going to be they're still going to be like saving up money for emergencies and stuff like that. And thirdly, is important why humans are still going to progress. And I think the best way is say, okay, you prove why competition stuff exists, but you have to eventually concede that progress is probably going to be slower, but you need to weigh it off by the fulfillment that individuals get. And it's okay if like society progresses slightly slower if people are more fulfilled. On opposition, I think there's two things that you need to do. Firstly is that you need to push the burden that this predominant belief will apply to everyone. You prove by picking and choosing like who it applies to does not work, and how narratives are spread. And maybe you can force proposition into one of two comparatives. Firstly, people continue just valuing money, like the value money, and those who don't value money are probably rich enough, and which means that they live fulfilling lives anyway, which means you symmetricize a lot of the claims that proposition is pushing. Or the second one, which you say that poor people are stuck and they have no way of getting out because they are forced into a narrative where they can't work any extra or try to earn any more money to get out of the bad situation that they're already in, because of this coercive effect of the narrative itself. The second piece of opposition strategy is that you claim you get fulfillment too, and you need to prove that you can retire early and all of that, which means is very high levels of fulfillment. And how you weigh this very importantly is you need to prove that okay, the fulfillment you can attain much later by the investment that you make now is far greater than the fulfillment that you can earn very small increments over X amount of time, which means that it is better to invest in long term than do it now. I think that's general case. And in terms of clashes, I think there's just two primary clashes that the debate would fall down onto. Firstly, on like fulfillment, Prop would probably weigh this on the scale of severity of fulfillment you're able to achieve, and because you have longer, more proximate fulfillment, they'll probably say that this fulfillment is better. Op would say it's fine if you don't have great amounts of fulfillment now, but if you achieve a very high level of fulfillment in the future when you're happy with your life and you have a lot of money to spend and travel around the world, it's probably better. In terms of the second clash, I think on societal progress and vulnerable individuals, opposite scale has to prove like why the scale of progress is so much greater and why this is important to society and why so many people are better off as a result of this. On prop, you need to weigh off like progress and talk about why some vulnerable individuals being significantly better off is a good enough trade-off to have slightly worse off societal progress, because society would get there anyway. So I think that's what the general debate would be. In terms of overall like strategy, I think it would be a very interesting debate, and I hope the debrief was helpful.